The Dark Room with your hosts, Paul Salvatori and Jordan Randall. Today we're speaking with George Elliott Clarke, Professor of English at the University of Toronto and Poet Laureate of Toronto, with a special interest in race.
Clarke is also the great-nephew of Jack White. No, not the lead singer of the White Stripes, but the labor union leader.
How do you actually introduce yourself at the cocktail party?
Oh my golly, that's a great question, but I think it really depends on the audience per se. I think of myself primarily as being a poet because that is what has led to everything else, and the scholarly person or persona, professorship, and even the whole performance aspect, all are a result of trying to be a poet first and fit into the public eye. On the other hand, if I'm going to meet an audience of other scholars, I'm probably not going to say I'm a poet first. I'm probably going to say, oh yeah, Professor of English, University of Toronto. So it's a great question, and it allows me to say that if I am multifaceted, I show different facets to different audiences at different times.
Interesting, yes. Because I could just imagine, like, one day you'll choose to, tonight I'll be introducing myself at the cocktail party as poet. I just feel that way. Tomorrow will be professor. It'll be, you have that.
It's how we roll.
Exactly.
And you have to just be ready for whatever happens. So I just want to think of a recent example of an interesting day for me. Well, I guess I can go back a couple of weeks. I wrote an introduction for a new book, a book of art, drawings, woodcut illustrations to be precise, of the former Prime Minister, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And that's a book that's just come out, illustrated by George A. Walker from Porcupine's Press. And I was really thrilled that George Walker asked me to write the introduction, so I do. And then I pick it up when it comes out, and there's a preface by a certain Justin Trudeau. And I couldn't help remarking to myself and to some folks that I was probably the only poet in the country with a book with a preface by Justin Trudeau. But for me, that was just because I have an interest in politics, and I've written about politics, and I worked on Parliament Hill. So for me, that connection, 6 degrees of separation, or whatever as it might be, made perfect sense that as a poet and a scholar, I would end up being part of a project that would also involve the new Prime Minister of Canada. It just made perfect sense. Today is Wednesday. I've got a preface by Justin Trudeau. Of course.
Exactly. Poetic justice.
Yeah.
So I also know, speaking of politics, that you've done quite a bit on race. And one of the things that fascinated me recently was your interview on TVO and the article, too, which I found quite intriguing, that was published in the Post. So just to start things off, before we even touch on that article, to what extent do you feel that we are living in a culture that is denying the existence of racism?
Well, the examples are everywhere. They are legion, and they are unstoppable. It's an irresistible force of denial, almost an irresistible force of denial from the powers that be. And the price of that, the consequence of that, I think, was illustrated actually in the past federal election this year, October 2015. Yeah. The example I come up with is the whole fracas and flap over the decision or choice of some Muslim Canadian women to wear the niqab, and the fact that this was turned into an election issue, especially in Quebec, was deeply offensive to me, because it represented the attempt of the Conservatives, especially, to play a Republican-style race card, but they must have known that they could. And that it would have some traction, to mix metaphors deliberately, at least in Quebec, or particularly there, thanks to their focus groups and their constant polling, et cetera, et cetera. They must have known that it would have allowed them to soften the NDP vote enough to reduce any chance that Mulcair might have had of leading towards a majority government. I'm taking a long time to answer the question very yes. Sharply and simply, perhaps. And that is that their pollsters and their advisors recognized that race remains a particular sensitive area amongst the Canadian electorate, to the point where a sitting prime minister was able to allow himself to go down in history as someone who was willing to speak a polite form of hate speech deliberately for the sake of trying to get a few votes from folks who might be politely described as pinknicks, if not rednecks, then pinknicks. I don't know for sure. I just make up the term as I go along,
Right.
and that this is shameful, as opposed to, I think any politician who deserves to be called a politician needs to fundamentally always be on the side of human rights and civil rights. Period. You can debate the environment, you can debate economic policies, but I mean these should be fundamentals for any Canadian federal politician. This should be like first base. It's like, this is, I don't go lower than that. If I got to go low,
Right.
I don't get below defending human rights and civil liberties. I don't go below that. If you got to go below that, then you shouldn't be sitting in office.
Mm-hmm.
You should be sitting in the ditch or sitting in the gutter where you belong, doing situational art. I got way far away from your question, but I mean, the reason why that was able to be developed even as an issue is because of the fact that we don't talk enough about race and the impact of racism and racialism and ethnocentrism on our polity. And because we ignore it as a point of discussion or point of debate, it allows folks to actually use divisions around race as wedge issues in election campaigns or in other areas. And so I again, to come back to your question and to give the original answer, we are in deep denial about the fact that we are an ethnically and racially hierarchically constructed society here. We like to point fingers at the United States, and as well we should, given our respective histories. On the other hand, the United States has an open discussion about race. In fact, their open discussion, I like to describe it this way. In Canada, or actually I should put it this way, in the United States, race is soap opera.
Okay.
In Canada, it's opera. And what I mean by that is that whenever incidents of racism, what might be racism, become public knowledge, it's treated as unusual, like a sopranic aria, right? So that's, it's almost artistic. It's way up there. It's above everybody because it's something that's really unusual. It's like a great achievement. In some ways, to get a discussion of race going on in this country. Whereas in the United States, race is the way you just talk. It's popular entertainment. And in fact, that's how racism gets constructed in the U.S. as kabuki theater. It's popular entertainment. It's popular culture, for crying out loud, right? And so you get the movies, not even on Black History Month, but throughout the year, you get the movies about this person stood up against the Klan, and this person stood up against segregation, and this person fought against racism in the armed forces, and this person did this, and this person was a butler, and this person became president, and it's sort of like, it's all entertainment. Whereas here, it's when it gets into the public eye, it's almost always a matter for academics or a royal commission, and then that's almost funny too, because the royal commission will come back and say, we think it was racism,
Right.
but it might not be, because this is Canada. So how could you have a racist incident? But every now and then we do get something that sounds a little bit or looks a little bit like racism, except that it will quickly be forgotten because it doesn't fit the general discussion points for what it means to be Canadian, or what problems we have as Canadians, etc.
Right. Now, also in the interview, I thought you made a very powerful statement. It was that there's this underlying feeling within our culture that people of color, and I'm quoting you just so you know, should not be here. And that was a very powerful statement, I found. And of course, it has to do with racism. So I'd like to know, could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, thank you, Paul, for Dr. Salvatori,
No.
Professor,
Yeah.
for suggesting that this was an interesting comment to make. And I just have to say that I came to it through a lifetime of experience, not as bad as the Toronto journalist Desmond Cole, who's written about being stopped by different police forces 50 times. 50 times.
Yes.
Just walking down the street, minding his own business, but being stopped, being asked to give account of himself. And those kinds of stories, and I've had similar incidents happen to me, not, I think, to the same number, and certainly not from peace officers or constables as much. But I started, and then of course there are the stories about so and so is driving a nice expensive car, a Range Rover, or a Rolls Royce, let's say, or something, or maybe something that's a little bit more downscale, like a Jaguar. If you can't afford a Rolls Royce, maybe you got a Jaguar instead. You're still making a little bit of a statement, but maybe you even go further downscale and you got a Volvo instead of a Jaguar. For crying out loud, right? If only everybody could have a Rolls Royce, but. All that to one side, I'm trying to get at those stories about black man in particular, sometimes a black woman, operating one of these vehicles, high-end, high-ticket, upscale vehicles, will be stopped by the police, and more than once, and many, many, many times, because of the sense that the suspicion the police have that kind of person should not be operating that kind of vehicle, and there might be a suspicion that he or she could only afford that kind of vehicle if he or she was involved in some kind of lucrative criminal activity. And so these stoppages become a kind of harassment, police harassment, or someone's dressed really nicely and they're walking down a street in an expensive neighborhood or pricey neighborhood on the Bridle Path or maybe Rosedale, or maybe the Beaches in Toronto, and a police officer has to stop that person and basically, where do you live? What are you doing here? What do you do for a living? Where do you come from? What's your name? And so I put all this together, all these various anecdotes and stories, and it hit me that the real problem, I think, what's going on with the police in general, when they decide that they really have to stop and question why somebody's driving that car, or wearing those kinds of clothes, or living in that particular neighborhood, or being in that particular neighborhood, is the sense, no matter how inarticulately felt it might be, that those persons of color, and especially black persons, are out of place. Because really, they're supposed to be at work somewhere and probably laboring, keeping in mind that all honest work is good work. But from a police perspective, one might be expected to be laboring at a low-income position of some sort. And certainly if you're driving something that looks like my car, a little bit beat up and showing its age, et cetera, or walking or not driving at all, or maybe you're in a taxi or public transit, but you shouldn't look like you're wealthy, or that you're a person of means, because that just violates the standard stereotype of a black person, or sometimes a person of color in general. And I'm being too mealy-mouthed here. I'll be blunt. I believe that police forces, especially across North America, don't realize that slavery is over, and still think that black people, especially black men, are supposed to be on a plantation somewhere, or in another country, but shouldn't be here, shouldn't be taking up public space, walking down a street or driving on a public highway. And especially if it's a late model, nice, excellent vehicle. You're not supposed to be doing those things, because you're supposed to be enslaved, or at the very least, you're supposed to be somebody else's responsibility. This goes back to, I think, in the backs of some people's minds, to the bad old days of slavery, when any white person really could stop any black person and ask for your papers. What are you doing here? Who are you? Who owns you? Why are you walking on this sidewalk? Why are you walking on this street? In broad daylight, or at night especially? What are you doing away from your slave quarters? What are you doing away from your slum, away from your ghetto? How dare you act like you're living a democracy and that you can go anywhere you want, any time of day or night, so long as you're not breaking the law explicitly. So I know this is a big, huge claim, and I'm dealing here with social psychology, but I do believe that, and again, especially for authorities and police forces, that there's this underlying belief that good, responsible black people are somebody's property, and are being managed by some responsible white person to ensure that they are not doing anything criminal, to ensure that they have their citizenship, to ensure that they receive proper guidance, because they obviously can't be expected to look out for themselves. And this goes back to one of the arguments, pro-slavery arguments, that was being made in the 19th century, that it would be criminal to free black people, to emancipate black people, because they really couldn't take care of themselves. They would be at the mercy of many unscrupulous folks who would exploit them, and then they would have to resort to crime because they wouldn't be able to get a job and feed themselves and clothe themselves and put roofs over their heads. When, as we know, when you look at the history objectively, the reason why folks had trouble feeding themselves and putting roofs over their heads and clothing themselves is because of the fact they were denied education. They were denied the right to live where they wanted to live. They were denied equal opportunity to employment. Yeah, I've said a lot. Maybe I'm even rambling a little bit here, but I do think that there's an underlying philosophy of distrust of the idea of liberty.
Yes.
For black people. It's okay that there was emancipation, abolition, and Martin Luther King having a dream. All that is very nice. But at the bottom, there's still a suspicion of, well, you really probably shouldn't be free. You really probably shouldn't be, because at least when you were a slave, you had guaranteed care and protection, and you were working responsibly. Yes, you're making money for somebody else, but that's okay because you had your 3 meals a day. It's like being in prison. And I think, to square the circle, so to speak, I think from the perspective of many police, black people should either be on a plantation or in a sweatshop or in prison, please. And the sooner the better.
Yeah, no, but what I want to ask is just about that, is how can we change as a society the police and the judicial system so that kind of thinking is not present?
The solution is so simple. It's so simple that it will be considered drastic by many, or by some, and particularly by the police. And that is, in a nutshell, one phrase: strict. I mean, emphasize strict civilian control of police, strict civilian oversight of police, strict, so that as soon as any incident comes about that can be proven in a court of law, where there's been abuse of police authority in any circumstance by anybody, so-and-so is relieved of his or her responsibility, medal, gun, and in most egregious circumstances, their personal liberty, and to go even further, their pension plan. And send them back to wherever they came from. Send them back to wherever they came from, and tell them if they want to be a police officer, they got to go back through police college and get more training. Mm-hmm. And I believe that a democracy must have that kind of very strict oversight of police. This would take in everything, because, to get away from race for a moment, the G20 disturbances in this city in 2010, it was egregious, outrageous police abuse of authority. And I didn't need a royal commission to come along 5 years later and say, yep, that's what it was, because clearly that's what it was. And of course, it was important to make sure that the summit tiers were safe and protected, et cetera, et cetera. And of course they were. But in terms of ensuring protection of the summit leaders, and at the same time providing ample opportunity for the citizenry to express their dislike, their distaste, their dissent from the policies embraced by the G8 and the G20, there should have been far more credence given to that, far more support given to the necessity for protest than what actually happened, which was actually ineffective, because, as it turns out, we had black box folks show up, anarchists show up, and tear up parts of the downtown core with impunity. And in terms of mums and dads and babes and strollers and babes in arms, they got kettled, they got charged, they got thrown into makeshift jail cells, et cetera, in the hundreds, right? And they were simply exercising the right of free speech and of dissent. And then these other folks who actually were blowing up police cars or setting them on fire and smashing bank windows and so on, and running amok with black masks over their faces and so on, I don't believe much happened to those folks. I think they managed to get back on buses or trains and go back home. Probably to Montreal. I'm just kidding. Oh, I love Montreal. But it's very suspect what happened that weekend, and a sign of the fact that the police were out of control. And the fact that we know that some of them tore their name tags, their Velcro name tags, off their uniforms so that they could beat up on protesters with their batons without being identified easily. We know that happened. There are plenty of images of officers whose name tags went missing. So when you allow those kinds of things to happen, you don't have a true democracy. You have something that's, and this is going to sound like an extreme statement, but I got to say it. You are closer to having a state where the police can do whatever they want, and some might want to call that a police state. And I know that that's a very severe term, an extreme term to use. But I don't believe that any well-functioning democracy can allow the police to tear their name tags off their uniforms and run around beating people upside the head. And if you allow that to happen, then you don't have a well-functioning democracy.
Yeah, no, it's funny because, I mean, we entrust as a society, police to not be those guys, right? That you're capable, even under duress, to not go into that mode, whatever you want to call it, of just doing whatever you want to people.
Yeah, if you,
Yeah.
I think if you want to do that, then you're in the wrong profession. You got to
Right.
be in the WWF. That's what you got to be. You got to be in
I know.
kickboxing,
Right, certainly.
or some other kind of martial arts arena.
Right, right.
If you want to like beat up on folks, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure,
But
sure.
yeah,
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you're talking about, though. I did get kettled at Queen and Spadina at the G20
Oh, wow.
thing. Yeah, it was awful. I wasn't there to protest either. I was just there to take some photos with a friend of mine. And yeah, it was a really, really bad scene. Like, everyone that was there was not the person that should be being apprehended at this point. Like, there was like a 9-year-old kid with a skateboard next to me.
Oh,
there
my
was an elderly couple walking their dog.
Oh.
Some guy stepped out of his restaurant to have a smoke break and got stuck in it in the middle. Like, it was a really bad, because it started raining really bad too, right? And people started getting sick. They were falling on the ground. Some guys started like hurling right next to me, and girls were asking the cops like they need to go to the washroom if they could leave, and the cops were being verbally abusive, being like, well, you should have thought about that before you came out here. It was really atrocious. And like at the end, they started arresting everyone and taking them to those makeshift like detention facilities that I think were like film studio sets. And yeah, it was funny because like it was such a bad position, because it was really like claustrophobic too, because they really kettled everyone into this really tiny quadrant. So like me and my friend ended up like, we overheard that they were arresting everyone. We're like, let's get to the front of the line and get arrested, because at least we'll get out of this situation. But the lineup was so long that it took about an hour to get to the front anyway, and by that time they just called the whole thing off. So
oh my
the
golly.
people that did get arrested did get sent off to these detention facilities, and then we just like went home totally soaked in rainwater and stuff, and
Oh.
traumatized. But it's funny because like you're saying, like the black bloc went with impunity down the streets and like setting cop cars on fire and stuff like this. And all these people weren't, like, the few people that were protesters that did get kettled there were definitely peaceful protesters. And all the people that weren't protesters later joined all the rallies, like, against what had happened at the G20. So it was really interesting to see, because it's like, okay, so it just basically made all these people into protesters now.
True, and I don't want to sound like I'm paranoid, but I've read enough history to realize that from time to time, police will use agent provocateur.
Yeah, I think they did, actually, because there was a suspicious guy stirring up the crowd, like, almost immediately when we got kettled there, and he was like, we got to get out of here, like, let's start like rioting to get out of here, and someone was like, no, like, that's a bad idea, though, we have to stay calm and stuff. But yeah, I definitely believe in those provocateurs. Like,
Yeah,
definitely.
that came to my mind, because I was thinking, you can't. How can a small group of people come to the middle of downtown Toronto with a heavy police presence, thousands of officers on the street, and with impunity tear up a block or half a block for 15 minutes, half an hour, and everybody standing back, letting them do whatever they want to do? To me, that sounds like classical agent provocateur activity to try to justify the amount of money put into it and the repression of ordinary folks who may have wanted to protest or may simply been in that part of the city on other business, only to be taught a lesson, which is why also how I see that incident, that it was the powers that be teaching the citizenry, thou shalt not protest, or thou shalt not protest outside of whatever parameters we actually allow you to use for your protests. And that if you choose to step outside those bounds still peacefully, well, this is what you can expect to have happen to you. So I really hope that the few charges that were laid against officers involved in that incident will in fact proceed properly to trial, and hopefully justice will be seen to have been done in the end of at the end of those processes. So basically, to say again, from my perspective, the right of citizens to protest has to be sacrosanct in society, in a democracy. And if that means that leaders and officers, for that matter, peace officers, find themselves feeling uncomfortable, so be it. That's the whole point of the protest, is that folks feel uncomfortable or realize, not unsafe, but uncomfortable,
Yeah.
realizing that people have reasonable concerns with some of the policies being enacted supposedly in our names, and that we ought to be able to register our disapproval. And that reminds me, I mean, we got the Magna Carta has been on display recently in Toronto, and in other cities across the country, quite wonderfully so. And well, it was very important, and I'm glad that many politicians came out to speak of their approval of this document and how majestic it is and how important it is as one of the signposts of the development of democracy. I also think it's really important that we remember that it's the people who brought democracy into existence, not politicians, but the people. The people were demanding the vote. And it took a long time for the vote to trickle down from the nobility to everyday persons, especially men, and then to women, and then to various ethnicities, and then to youth, finally, in this country, 1972. So it was a long process, took centuries. And so the idea of the development of democracy is not something that we can take lightly or leave in the hands of politicians. As soon as we leave democracy in the hands of politicians, we're not going to have a democracy anymore. I'm laughing. Don't worry, folks. I'm laughing. I know that might have sounded like an extreme statement. What I'm really trying to say is that civil liberties are a responsibility of the people, not of politicians.
Sure.
Certainly.
So I want to ask also, like, in terms of what you were saying before with, like, police forces in particular making these sort of, unjust assumptions for groups of color or whatever, like having an upscale car or whatever, like stuff like that. Do you think that those assumptions are like perpetuated by white cops? Because there's black cops too, right? Like, are they still the kind of people that would see like another black person driving like a fancy car and be like, from everything I've learned at police academy, I should, bust this person? Or can they at least cross that line because of empathy? Or
well, with due respect to the difficulties of black police officers, and they do have their difficulties, and I've known a couple, and they have divulged information to me about some of the challenges that they have faced being black officers on of course, mainly white forces. And on the other hand, there's also a culture of policing that I am truly ignorant of. But I do know that for any black officer, a minority officer, or woman officer to get along with the majority officers, there has to be a certain amount of adoption of the general culture related to policing. And if that means that a black officer or white female officer finds himself, herself involved in violating the civil liberties of a black supposed suspect, well, maybe that is what would happen. Stephen Biko, the late anti-apartheid activist in South Africa, makes the argument that as soon, and this is going back to the apartheid era in South Africa, so his argument was that as soon as a black police officer puts on that uniform, he ceases to be black and becomes as oppressive as the white South African police officers were during the apartheid regime. And I think what Biko is really saying is that you become part of the culture of suppression, part of the culture of repression. And so then on the positive side, it could mean that minority officers or women officers might actually bring a different perspective and say, we can approach matters differently or think in a more holistic way about policing. But it can also mean that in order for them to survive and prosper in their careers, that they basically adopt the same attitudes and do the same things as white officers always had done, et cetera, in order to be considered part of the fraternity or the sorority or fraternity/sorority of peace officers. So, uh, and then too, I got to keep in mind that depending on where a person or body has originated, and I'm thinking in particular of Caribbean nations, West Indian nations. I've been to a few, and I know that notions of law and order are taken very seriously, and rightly so. I add, rightly so, and that folks who come up through the socialization in these nations might in fact have just as harsh a view of the necessities involved in policing as someone who simply comes to the position with racist perspectives. But the outcome might still be the same because of their interest in imposing what they would consider to be a nice, good, old-fashioned British West Indies perspective on law and order, as opposed to a nasty, racist perspective on law and order, which again may end up looking pretty much the same. Keeping in mind that the death penalty, for instance, is still very much in favor in the BWI nations. So if you happen to bring that kind of philosophy to your policing, you're probably not going to be big on notions of liberalism and maybe not. Yeah, I mean, I emphasize probably not really big on notions of liberalism and look the other way and emphasize community based cooperation as opposed to shoot first and ask questions later kind of approaches. But I hasten to add, I'm no expert on policing. I just go by what I read in the newspapers, listen to what I hear on the radio, and follow various events on the internet. But I hope that what I'm saying doesn't sound too removed from reality.
I don't think
Oh,
so.
certainly not. No, not at all. No, it's fascinating. It all makes very much sense. So, I know you've dedicated so much of your work to researching and publishing on the Black experience in Canada, and I'm just interested in knowing how much have you actually seen it create your own writings create an impact in the culture, whether we're talking about curriculum or something else, because I have to say I wish I had more of that as part of my own curriculum in elementary school. Every time you learn about Canadian history, you learn the same thing, the same narrative. And so, you automatically assume, okay, this is the way it is until, you're informed better later on in university. Or at least it was for me. I mean, that's when I got the different perspectives. And I'm wondering, so have you seen it had like an impact in that kind of way?
Whoa, that's a great question too. Huge question, huge. Oh my golly!
It's like I apologize.
I don't even know where to start.
Yeah.
I think there has been a slight impact. I mean, I'm not talking about my own writing here. I think I'm talking about what I describe as African Canadian literature,
Right.
and I think might call it Black Canadian writing. I think that particularly in the academy for university students, there is going to be some exposure to that writing, whether it's works by Lawrence Hill, Book of Negroes, or Dion Brand or Austin Clarke, and a few others. Emner Basie Phillip might be considered to be really well-known African Canadian writers or Black Canadian writers if they prefer that nomenclature. Yeah, for undergraduates, graduate students who might choose to work on their work. Yeah, and the fact that the Book of Negroes became a TV series in Canada is huge. It's important. So there's been some further dissemination of the history and so on. And and certainly the writings of Austin Clarke and Dion Brand have talked a lot about urban situations of discrimination, racism, sexism, homophobia. And again, particularly for university audiences, it's partly a sense of speaking to the converted, but it's also partly this material, these or their writings also serve as enlightenment for those who might go on to become teachers or police officers or sociologists or lawyers and so on. They can have a better sense of what it means to live in a multicultural, multi-faith, multiracial society or democracy as Canada is, and especially urban Canada. On the other hand, I still believe that the powers that be, the organs of cultural shaping, so to speak, and of education for the most part in the country, still prefer a Don Cherry vision of Canada. Let me put it that way. And that's not anything against Mr. Cherry, but the idea of a Canada that is what it is: majority white, majority Christian. And again, this is not anything against any. This is I'm totally pro-Christian, pro-white, pro-Caucasian, pro-European. This is not any kind of racialist utterance here, but just recognizing that there's a self-concept of Canada as being a white Christian country, and in terms of numbers, that's what it is. On the other hand, is it possible for us to make room? Is it possible for us to make room for other conceptions of the country, or for a more generous and insightful and comprehensive vision of Canada as being, as I describe it, multicultural, multiracial, and multi-faith? Can we start to move our conversation towards that vista of Canada? I do see, in fact, the place where you see it really reflected is in advertising. That's where you see the real Canada, the contemporary Canada, and especially contemporary urban Canada. I was in a cinema recently and saw an ad. I forget for what it was. I'm not gonna name the company anyway. Why should I? I'm not gonna give them any extra. But I just want to point out that the advertising company decided to show an interracial family, a black man, woman who might be white, and mixed children, either through procreation or through divorce or remarriage or blended family, whatever. But in any event, that was the point. That it was an interracial couple with an interracial family of children, and I don't believe that the United States is anywhere close to providing that kind of vision of reality of the way that we form families now in Canada, without, for the most part, in urban Canada, I hasten to add, without necessarily a whole lot of kerfuffle and second thought about it and worrying and so on. Maybe I shouldn't call the other version of Canada the Don Cherry version, although I just did it again. But I think it's time to add to that vision of the country a more Air Canada vision, or Air Canada, Scotiabank, World Bank, TD Bank, Bell Canada, Rogers, so on. And the reason I'm mentioning all these corporations is because by law, all these corporations in banking, telecommunications, and airlines, I better add WestJet quickly here as well. Porter, I'll add Porter as well. Airlines, banking, and telecommunication companies, all of them have to report annually to Parliament every year on how well they are representing visible minorities, women, Indigenous people, and physically challenged people. All these groups have to be tabulated in terms of employment by these three industries every year. They have to report to Parliament. And so that's why you walk into a bank, you see it looks more like Canada. You get on an airline, you buy an airline ticket. If you buy it at the counter, you're going to be served by a multiracial, multicultural, multi-faith version of the country. You walk into the banks, that's what you see. And the reason why is not because necessarily these corporations, or Rogers, or CBC, or Bell, it's not necessarily because of the fact that they're really liberal and humanitarian and really want to help out and promote this, although maybe I should say that they probably do want to promote this liberal humanitarian or a down-to-earth vision of the country, is partly because they're expected to by law. And so these industries have actually led the way in providing visually a more representative picture of the country than have some others, simply because of the fact that they have that reporting mechanism in place for Parliament. So, and that allows me to go further and say, for all those folks who complain about employment equity, which we sometimes refer to as affirmative action, but it's not. It's really it's employment equity. I want to say, if you want to complain about it, go picket your local bank branch, picket the airlines, picket the telecommunication companies, because what you're seeing in those industries is the benefit of employment equity in place, working, viable, and I don't hear many noises from those corporations complaining about the fact they have to be more comprehensive in their hiring policies. I don't see them complaining. In fact, they've benefited because when they have minority groups represented, they can sell mortgages better to those minority groups. They can sell airline tickets better to those minority groups. They can provide telecommunications better to those minority groups when they have those groups represented in their employment profiles. So I say more employment equity, more, not less, more, and mandate it if necessary, mandate it. And all those who don't like it, they should all go move to the U.S.
That's fascinating.
In quotation marks.
Right. That's fascinating. I think only a poet can lead literature into like hiring policies. That's why it was really. I was like, wow. But so I have to ask you to go back now to your art. Just the basic question: what inspires you?
Oh my golly, everything. Everything. I try to be open to everything. But of course, I mean, I tend to write mainly poetry that deals with the history of race relations, the image of the black in the West, and the struggle for a more humanitarian society framework. But I like nature. I write my nature poems. I don't like mosquitoes, but I like nature. And I write lots of poems about love, and I've even written a book of children's poems, influenced by my daughter, Aurelia, and so I try to be open to lots of different experiences and ideas and concepts. A lot of things interest me. And I don't tend to write many political poems. I mean, poems that are directly on a particular subject, political, not generally, unless I feel really moved, bothered, disturbed, angered.
Right.
Then I got to bring out the poison pen and get busy attacking something or some group of people. And so on the other hand, I find for me, prose and the essay journalism are better ways for me personally to wade into a political controversy of one sort or another, and to make my views known. But in terms of poetry, it tends to be a little bit more removed from day-to-day struggle, and more related to meditation on historical incidents. And also, I want to have fun. I want to write poetry that makes me laugh from time to time, a good belly laugh,
Right.
in response to some issue or problem, and so on, or just that will, I hope, amaze and amuse the reader or the auditor because of the particular use of language that I bring out or bring together, and imagery. So in terms of, in fact, I got as part of a recent event honoring the great writer Austin Clarke. No relation, although he and I have often joked about the possibility of our being related. But probably not. In any event, I was part of the event to honor him, and I decided I would do so in part by writing a poem that was based on his great short story when he was free and young and he used to wear silks. And so what I did was I reread the short story, and I took from the short story all of the words that for me were most interesting. And then I wrote a poem that's a retelling of the story, um, using the key terms that I identified in his story, but then also introducing some, of course, some other words too of my own, but still essentially shadowing. I think that's really what it was doing. It's a kind of shadowing or echoing his story, but as poem, as opposed to, of course, the original short fiction. So I was inspired to do that. Yeah, that's a question of inspiration, but it was also fun. It was a lot of fun to rewrite that story in a sense, in my terms, but rewrite that story. And often I have a lot of fun doing that, trying to rewrite something. In my book Red, I wrote a boiled down version of the autobiography of Malcolm X. Boiled down, stripped down version. It's only like eight or 9 pages long, but the angle I took was to pretend that Malcolm was still a gangster.
Oh, wow.
So I rewrote in a very condensed form, all right? But I rewrote the autobiography of Malcolm X with X talking like he's still a gangster, like he never got over it. Despite it being in the Nation of Islam, et cetera, and produced it in those. I wrote the poem in those terms, as fun, also with a great deal of reverence for Mr. X, but I also had a lot of fun, right? Just imagining, what if he really hadn't changed? What if he really was still a gangster? I still allow him to have revolutionary ideas and thoughts and express them, but definitely from a gangster position.
Oh, I have to read that. So he goes through all the transitions that he did in real life, but is just in this voice.
Yeah,
Oh,
in the
fascinating.
gangster voice, with a gangster recognition of the realities of power and corruption, and so on.
Yeah.
And I imagine that it probably in his private, deepest, remotest thoughts, he never quite left behind Detroit Red.
Right.
His gangster
That's
persona.
right,
He never
right,
quite
yes.
left it behind. You mean, it was Minister Malcolm X, Detroit Red.
That's amazing. I will have to check that out. Yeah.
With full respect for
Right.
everything that he represented in terms of progressive political thought.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So, historically, like we've consulted with poets on the big question, what is love? So naturally, in the presence of the poet laureate,
Holy smokes.
I have to ask you because I still haven't figured that one out. So, what is love? I guess is the only way I know to ask it. As a poet, as a person who's
Oh my golly! You've
Yeah.
gone from one tough question to an even tougher question. But on one hand, it's a simple question because what comes to mind immediately are what could be considered a series of cliches. I start with being a child and with being a parent. I think these are the first and the most primal experiences of whatever love is. It has to do with that. It has to do with caring and wanting to preserve, wanting to protect, wanting to cherish and nurture and nourish that other person or being or beings, plural, and wanting the best for them, including the sacrifice of oneself. And so love is an umbrella. It's an umbrella concept, and it's many different facets. There's the familial love of parents and siblings, and of course children. There's the erotic in terms of a partner or partners, depending on how one's life works out in that regard, and also the more abstract love of art or of a particular your nation, patriotism, and so on. But I mean, it's almost not important to talk about those versions of love because they don't necessarily have consequence. Not necessarily. They're not necessarily consequential. But love of a partner, spouse, a child, children, parents, siblings, relatives, these are consequential because they are ultimately biological. And so they are deeply consequential. Whereas the love of nation or of an ideology or even an art is or fidelity to these notions is not necessarily a matter of consequence. It's a matter of affiliation, as opposed to a matter of deep heartfelt feeling. So I still haven't answered your question. I haven't.
Yes.
Yeah, but as a poet, holy smokes, love is truth, truth is love, love is beauty, beauty is love. I'm implying Keats here, or rewording Keats in a way, where he talks about truth is beauty and beauty is truth. That's all you need to know on this planet, Keats says. That's all you need to know, is that beauty is truth and truth is beauty. Okay, but what if your particular version of beauty is ugly? Does the Keatsian mode still apply? I don't know. But there's something attractive about those grand abstract concepts. So maybe love is truth, and maybe love is beauty, and that the truest truth you can know is love for another person, and hopefully reciprocate it, and love for a child or children, etc., etc. I know I'm voicing cliches, etc. But at a fundamental level, I don't know if it's possible to get away from them. There's always going to Plato, right, and the Symposium,
Right.
for definitions of love, et cetera, et cetera. But in the end, I mean, his definition of love is pretty utilitarian and militaristic, for crying out loud. Love is your love of your fellow soldier, for crying out loud. As you go about protecting a particular city, state, or whatever in ancient Greece, fine. But I prefer, I suppose, a notion of love as up to and including sacrifice for those whose well-being you cherish more than your own.
Oh, that's a beautiful definition. Yeah.
Do you think that, even maybe despite your efforts, that poetry is a dying art?
Oh, no. No. Poetry is never a dying art. And the reason is simple, because whenever anybody needs to express an emotion in words that have impact, that change the other person's mind or other people's minds, or move people in some way, shape, or form to feel something or act or do something, you need a poem. You need a bunch of poems. You need a phrase or two. You need rhetoric. And poetry is a branch of rhetoric, or maybe I should say rhetoric is a branch of poetry. And we often use the term rhetoric pejoratively, but it isn't. It's just the science of speech. Rhetoric is simply the science of speech, the art of speech. It's nothing negative. Rhetoric only becomes negative when it's used by politicians. But in the mouths of poets and from the pens of poets, rhetoric is an extremely powerful instrument, for crying out loud, for moving people to think and feel in certain ways, different ways. So long as human beings have brains, and so long as they have the ability to write or to speak or to express language in some way, poetry will be there. It will be there, as it always has been, automatically. And I know, as someone who consciously eavesdrops on other people's conversations, that people spontaneously come up with poetic phrases and lines and language without thinking about it, because they really want to get across a perspective or point of view to someone else. And so they automatically slide into a poetic register of speech. When folks want to send that Valentine or send that loving email, or even now letter writing might be a dying art, although I hope not. But maybe some of us will still want to write those love letters, and so we're going to find ourselves moving towards the poetic, or the letter to the editor. In order to make a pithy point, we might find ourselves writing in a haiku-like style in order to pungently express a perspective. So about once a year, roughly once a year, the New York Times, to name one, will do an article along those lines. Is poetry dead? Is poetry dying? And I love that, because it means that the journalist is going to eat another day, because the answers that the journalist is going to receive are going to be voluminous about how poetry remains so central. The only places where poetry might be thought of as dying is in public speech. and particularly in legislatures and parliaments. And to come back to myself being poet laureate, one of the things I tried to do was to remind city council at least once a year they need to have a poet laureate to remind them of good public speech, what good public speech is capable of. When we think about the really great politicians of the 20th century, democratic politicians of the 20th century, well, look, Winston Churchill is right up there. John F. Kennedy is there. Pierre Elliott Trudeau is also there. If you look at his writings, for instance, his travelogue about his visit to China in 1960. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X was mentioning in a kind of joking fashion a little while ago, but seriously, these are all folks, these are all people who are able to use the English language very well. Great poetry. I don't know French as well, but I know René Lévesque. René Lévesque was a great speaker of French, great orator, for crying out loud. And all of these politicians were touched, or public speakers, they are all touched with a little bit of poetry. They had a little bit of poetry going on. John F. Kennedy, oh yeah, he'd slide into poetry in a second because he knew that the poetry could go places where the simple prose sentence could not go. In other words, to energize the heart and the mind, to commit people to a project. The reason why a human being or human beings went to the moon was because of John F. Kennedy's poetry about the moon mission. If he'd spoken in just simply scientific jargon and economics about this will be great for the economy, for the military industrial complex put together an Apollo mission to land somebody on the moon, it might have been great. That might have still happened, but it really happened because people started dreaming about, that would be kind of cool, and started dedicating themselves to this idea of we're gonna put human beings on the moon because of poetry, for crying out loud. So, I think that any politician worth his or her salt had better come to the microphone with a poem if they want to get the public on their side. It better be a good poem, and it better be clear, accessible, in order to get people together, or even to come. I mean, Jimmy Carter was running for president in 1976-77, or it's 1976 to be precise, in the U.S. Who was he quoting? James Dickey, Bob Dylan. Oh yeah, he came up with the Bob Dylan quotations here and there to let people know that he was cool, that he was on side, he was down to earth, he was progressive, didn't hurt. And I think there's always a role for poetry and public speech, and I think parliamentarians who want to get reelected, legislators who want to get reelected, ought to come to the public podium with either a poem or a poet.
Okay. No, thank you so much.
Thank you,
Professor.
Jordan.
Yeah.
Paul.
Thank you so much
Yes,
for
thank
taking
you.
the time to do
Thank
this.
you. This is great. I
Yes.
really appreciate it.
Yeah. I feel very light, honestly, just from all your incredible insight. So, Jordan, I think it's clear from what George was saying is that the legacy of racism still exists in society today, even though people are saying that we're living in this post-Obama era. What do you think?
I think
how were you feeling when he was talking about?
It's funny because you always try and be hopeful when you're looking around at the world around you, and I think that sometimes maybe that does get the better of people, and there is a bit of a veil that comes up when you're being hopeful, and there is a lot behind the veil that you sort of don't see because of that. And I think he's right. I think that racism, it's been a problem, it is a problem, and it'll continue to be a problem for, not obviously something that's desirable, but for the foreseeable future.
Right. As he points out, the problem is that people, I think, whatever their race, generally have an issue or they have a challenge with putting themselves in the shoes of other people. And it's easy to forget what someone else is going through unless you're living that same life. So, as he was talking, I was thinking that really the way that we're going to make a better society for racism to begin to fade is if we somehow get people to become more empathetic towards the struggles of other people. But how that's possible still is a mystery, because people can read about the stories in the news of racism. They can have friends who are experiencing racism, but they're not because of, say, privilege. But if you're not living that hard life, it's easy to turn a blind eye just because it's easier to live the life of not being oppressed. So he raised that question in me when he's talking about how do we get people to actually not just be aware but to care, and on a regular basis. I mean, any idea, like, I mean, what is
such
that?
a tough thing. I mean,
Yeah.
because awareness is like, it is the first step, but there are other steps, right? And yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, what can you do? And it's true that people, problems aren't as immediate unless it's on your doorstep, right? So a lot of
Right.
people do just sort of wander through all this racism with blinders on.
Right. I think maybe that's the power of his poetry, is he's able to express things that you can't just express in regular language. I mean, it's so powerful, it's so moving, that maybe if we can tap into people's feelings, not just their thoughts, but their feelings, you can motivate people to come together and to fight as a community of one, and then the change can happen.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you guys are going to want to check out next week's show, which is with Dave Cat, who's married to a doll, and he identifies as an idolater.
Sounds kind of creepy to me.
It's a real life-size doll.
Sounds like that movie, Lars and the Real
Right,
Girl.
right.
Yeah, I should ask him about that.
For sure.
Well, till next time.
This is The Dark Room.